Welcome to Learning Unit 2. In the previous Learning Unit, we looked very briefly at what is ITIL, and we gleaned that ITIL is best practice for IT service management. So in Learning Unit 2, we're going to explore a number of terms and concepts associated with IT service management. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to recall the definition of what is a service. What do we mean by utility and warranty? What is the role of customer, role of user? What is service management actually in terms of organisational capability? What is the role of a sponsor? Later we'll also look at key concepts of creating value through services and describing the key concept of service relationships. Section 2.1, definitions. Services and products. So one of the big questions that people often are still confused about is, what do we mean by the term service? So ITIL provides a definition. It says a service is a means of enabling value, co-creation by facilitating outcomes that customers want to achieve without the customer having to manage specific costs and risks. Okay, so quite a mouthful there, but actually if we strip it down, and you can see that we've underlined the key words VOCR, value, outcomes, costs and risks. So a service is a means of enabling value. So if a service doesn't deliver, create value, then why should somebody use it? Yeah. If you think of an insurance organisation that uses IT services to run its insurance business, those IT services that they take must create some form of value to allow them to do things which without it they either couldn't do or couldn't do as well. It needs to facilitate outcomes. Outcomes is the results that are important for customers to achieve. So again, for an insurance organisation, the outcomes it wants to achieve are selling policies to customers, updating policies for existing customers, capturing payments, processing claims, paying out on claims. Those are the outcomes that an insurance organisation needs to achieve. So their IT services must support those outcomes. Again, if they don't, why are we using them? And then without the customer having to manage specific costs and risks, you'll see later that we make a distinction between the costs of provision and the costs of consumption. Okay, so in this context, the service, the customer is interested in the costs and risks associated with consumption, not interested in managing the costs and risks associated with the provision of service. So when you're looking at an exam question around what is the definition of a service, try and remember that acronym of VOCR. A service must enable value, it must facilitate outcomes, and the customer doesn't need to worry about managing specific costs and risks of the provision of a service. What's a product? Well, it says there a product is a configuration of an organisation's resources designed to offer value for a customer. So what does that mean? Well, if you think about services, they are underpinned by a lot of technology components and products. A batch scheduler is important in underpinning a service when up-to-date information is required, such as updating a customer's bank account. We invest in lots of tools to monitor and manage availability and performance. And so product is often, if you like, below the line. It's not something that necessarily the customer is A, aware of, or B, needs to be worried about. But it's important in terms of a component of the service that we provide. So service and product, there is a relationship, but product typically are the things that help underpin and deliver the service, typically not visible to the customer. Now I'm going to give you an example of service and product just to bring those sort of definitions alive. And to do so, I'm going to just show this. I would imagine most people on this course have got a mobile phone. So let's use the mobile phone as a really good example of what we mean by service and what we mean by products. So in terms of the service, well, when you actually purchase a new mobile phone, maybe you go into a contract with a mobile service provider, the phone itself at that point, once you open the box and take it out, actually it's not really of much use. It only becomes useful to you, when it's connected to the network, when you get the connectivity for the service. So the phone really is a product. Later we might call it goods. It doesn't actually do anything, but you need a phone to be able to use a mobile phone service. But it is the service that creates the value, because without that service, it's just a piece of technology that, to be fair, doesn't do an awful lot. So it is the service that creates the value and those outcomes that you wish to achieve, i.e. being connected, being in touch with colleagues and friends, being able to download apps, maybe being able to pay a bill online using a mobile banking application. When we look at products, over and above the phone and the charger, which of course as a consumer we would need to use the service, part of the service will include, for example, itemized billing. So at the end of every month, you get a bill of what you've used, maybe within the agreed price plan, and any items that you may have used outside of that price plan. And of course, you get the financial amount that you need to pay to continue to use that service. Now, from a product perspective, you are interested only in getting your itemized bill because it's part of the service. You're not really interested in the billing system. You're not really interested in the sort of CRM system that might be underpinning all the customers of a mobile phone company. You're only interested in the itemized billing. But there are products which are used by your mobile phone provider to deliver your itemized bill, but you don't see them and you're not really interested in them. When we talk about the associated costs and risks, there is costs to you as a consumer and there are costs to the provider. So in the service definition, it says without needing to worry or manage the associated costs and risks. And that's really the costs and risks of provision. So if you think of your mobile phone provider, if you think of the 5G network, the 4 and 3G network, the sort of international telecommunications links, the network monitoring, the resilience that's put in place, significant amount of cost, and that cost is to the provider. You, as a consumer of the service, you have a price plan or a service offering. So you agree that you will pay a certain amount of money on a monthly basis for maybe unlimited texts, unlimited calls, and maybe a fixed amount of data, maybe 10 gigabytes of data, and you'll pay an appropriate amount of money. So the cost to you of the consumer, is your usage of the service. And that's very different from the cost of provision, which of course is that massive investment in network technology, international telecommunication links, etc. So just understand this distinction when we talk about costs and risks of provision, which is with the provider, and costs and risks of consumption, which are with the consumer. So we need to introduce two terms which perhaps are not familiar in the sort of day-to-day IT workplace: utility and warranty. And these are important. So you need to understand what they are, and you need to understand how they sort of, if you like, relate to each other. So if we say that a service is about creating value, then to create value, a service needs to demonstrate both utility and warranty. You can't deliver value with only one. You must deliver utility, you must deliver warranty. So what is utility? So utility is the functionality offered by a product or service to meet a particular need. It's what the service does. So if you think of our insurance company with a contact centre taking calls from existing customers and potentially new customers looking for insurance products, then the service must provide the functionality that allows, for example, new policies to be created, existing policies to be updated, payments to be captured, claims to be recorded, claims to be processed and paid. Yeah, it's the functionality that allows the insurance company to do what they need to do to be successful, to achieve those outcomes that are important. Warranty is the assurance that a product or service will meet agreed requirements. So it's how the service performs. So there's no point having fantastic functionality if when the contact centre wants to use the service, it's down. There's no point having fantastic functionality if when you get more than 10 users on the system, it runs really, really slow and customers get frustrated, they put the phone down, they can't be bothered to wait. Okay, so warranty is very much around the assurance that the service will do what it needs to do when required. So typically this covers things like availability, hours of service. It has to be available between certain times. It will cover capacity and performance, because for some services, performance and response times are really important. It has to recover things like service continuity. So if the service is so important to the business, it creates so much value for the business. If it fails, we need to be able to recover the service quickly. And of course, it needs to be secure. It needs to be secure so customers can feel confident that information and data that's recorded about them is safe and secure and not going to be compromised. So utility, functionality, warranty, assurance. And it's important that every service, if it's to create value, must demonstrate utility, must demonstrate warranty. If you have one and not the other, then you ain't going to create value through the service. Let's look at some roles. Now, in ITIL, there are many roles implied, as we'll see later: incident manager, change manager, problem manager. But the only three roles that are explicitly covered in Foundation are roles within what we'll call the consumer organisation. In other words, the area of your organisation that takes your IT services, the business areas that use your services. In ITIL, we tend to refer to those as consumer organisations, and the only roles that we cover explicitly are three roles in the consumer organisation: customer, user and sponsor. Now, it's really important that you understand these roles, and it's really important that if you get a question in an ITIL exam that talks about a user, or it talks about a customer or a sponsor, that you remember and recall the ITIL definition of these roles. The reason I mention this is quite often the term customer and user can be quite interchangeable. If we work in a service desk, we often talk about our customers. We often talk about service desk and customer satisfaction. Whereas actually in ITIL, we're very clear as to what is a user, what is a customer, and what is a sponsor. So it's really important we understand the difference and distinction between these roles. I'm going to do them in reverse order. So let's look at sponsor. So sponsor is a role in the consumer organisation that authorises the budget for service consumption. IT doesn't come for free. The services you provide need to be paid for. So it's important within the consumer organisation that we have someone who is in place to ensure the budgets are in place, who can authorise the budget expenditure for the services that you're going to use. And I'd make the point that, this budget is not just for the creation of, say, the brand new shiny thing. It's also the ongoing costs of those IT services. So making sure budget is in place to consume those services. User. User. Users contact the service desk talks to users. Even if you're the chief executive of the organisation or his or her personal assistant, if you contact the desk In ITIL, you are a user. So user is for anyone who uses the service, and that's really important to understand. Okay. Customers do not talk to the desk. The desks do not talk to customers. User, user, user. And we'll amplify and remind you of this when we go through the appropriate practices later in the course. The final role is customer. And the customer role is quite important because it's the customer role that defines the requirements for a service and takes responsibility for the outcomes of the service. Okay, so think of the customer maybe as a single role representing the service into the service provider, representing the service back into the consumer organisation. And this point about takes responsibility for the outcomes of a service, just to give you an example of what we mean by this. So if you think of the service provider providing those contact centre services to an insurance organisation, so the insurance contact centre, so all that sort of telecommunications data and sort of network sort of infrastructure, that's really key in supporting a large contact centre operation. The customer is clearly interested in making sure that they get the quality of service required from IT to allow that contact centre to deliver excellent service for their end customer. However, if the contact centre doesn't have enough staff to actually take the calls at peak periods of the day, if as a result of that their customers get frustrated and put the phone down, so their abandonment rate goes really high, if they actually get complaints from their customers about the poor service, then that isn't a responsibility of IT. We're delivering the IT services, but to get the best possible outcomes from that service, the contact centre needs to ensure it has enough agents to handle the volume of calls at the peak periods of time. If they don't, then that's a responsibility for the customer. It's not a responsibility for the provider. So that's what we mean by takes responsibility for the outcomes of service consumption. So the customer is quite a key role. You can consider the customer role as cradle to grave, from the start of a service through its use of a service to maybe ultimately its retirement and decommissioning. So important, I say, we understand these three roles. Sponsor authorises budget, user uses the service, customer defines the requirements of a service and takes responsibility for the outcomes, those results of the service within the consumer organisation.